Hello and welcome to the Lobster Podcast, aka Day 2 of the Product Earth Seminar Zone. Those of us who didn't get to do the presentations because Day 2 was cancelled now have the opportunity to do so digitally. So, in the spirit of that, today's seminar, actually, it's that side, so no, that side. I don't know. Either way, I'm trying to present our next speaker, who is Peter Reynolds, who, if you are from the UK, you probably have heard of. He's a passionate cannabis advocate, the president of Clear, and an author as well. Welcome, Peter. How are you doing today?
How do you do, Dave? I'm fine, thank you. Thank you for having me.
Not at all, not at all. Now, we're going to be talking about 100 Years of Bad Drugs Policy, which is a presentation based on a book you're currently writing, isn't that right?
That's right. I'm supposed to. I'm in the process of completing it. And it should be published in the summer of next year.
Very cool. Very cool. Excellent. Well, look forward to hearing more about it. So, yeah, over to you when you're ready. And yeah,
Thank you. Thank you. Okay. So 100 years of bad drugs policy. It will be 100 years from next year, from 2025. Will be the anniversary of the International Opium Convention in 1925, which was the first time that what is called, completely incorrectly in my view, what is called international drug control first came into being. The idea that prohibition is control, I think we all know after 100 years of experience, is exactly wrong. Prohibition is not control. In fact, it's an abandonment of control. That's the title of my book. It will be coming out next year. And essentially what it says is that bad drugs policy is an existential threat. Now that may seem a very dramatic thing to say, but I think what I'm going to set out through this presentation is the reason why, unless we change course, the drugs policy we've followed over the past 100 years is going to destroy our society and indeed our civilization. It's already doing so if you look at it. I mean, the UK government says that current drugs policy costs £20 billion per annum, which is big enough, just happens to coincide with that infamous black hole. But I would suggest that's just the tip of the iceberg of what it really costs us. So let's look at what drugs policy is. And I mean, the purpose of drugs policy is to reduce harm. And there are two types of harm. There's the health harms of drugs themselves. And obviously that varies depending upon what drugs we're talking about. And then there's the social harms caused by the drugs trade, by the criminal trade in drugs. And I think it's well established that the harms caused by the drugs trade massively outweigh the health harms of drugs. Professor Johanna Ivers of the University College of Dublin said recently that 90%, more than 90% of all drugs use is without any harm to the user or to wider society. And that's all drugs. So that includes heroin and crack cocaine. So you could well say that softer drugs, if you like that term, such as cannabis, massively more than 90% causes no harm to the user and no harm to wider society. It's the criminal drugs trade that is the real problem. So let's just see the wider picture. You know, since 2001, since the Twin Towers came down, there have been over 1 million deaths in armed conflicts. This is just the main wars, if you like. But in that same period, there have been over 500,000 deaths from drugs overdoses just in the USA alone. There's been over 50,000 deaths from drugs overdoses just in the UK. And just in Mexico, over 350,000 deaths attributed to organized crime. So if you add all these together, and then you add up all the other countries in South America where there've been mass murder, like the Philippines, places like this, you know, no one is counting the total cost of bad drugs policy, or even if you don't call it bad drugs policy yet, I mean, if you just, you know, just putting forward this argument, drugs policy, the total cost of drugs policy vastly exceeds everything else. The war on drugs is World War III. We're already there. Millions of deaths, Millions of people are being criminalized. Billions is spent on law enforcement, which is largely futile. The United States publishes openly that it spends $50 billion every year on drug law enforcement. So the total cost of this bad drugs policy, stay with me, I think you'll agree with me, it's bad by the time we get to the end, is the total cost of this bad drugs policy is in the trillions. And then beyond that, there's even greater indirect costs of societal breakdown, because we've created this huge edifice of drugs crime. We've chosen to do it. Prior to 1925, none of this existed. We chose to do it. All police, our police forces, law enforcement throughout the world, they spend more time on drugs crime than on anything else. You know, this largely is the reason why you can't get a burglary responded to, or you can't, you know, if an old lady gets knocked over in the street, the police don't turn up. And, you know, because they're chasing drugs crime. You know, the reason we have such bad relationships between police and ethnic minorities is because they're stopping and searching people for cannabis. So, in fact, trying to stop and search people for knives, which everyone would support, is interfered with by the fact that they're trying to stop people for cannabis. As I said, the USA spends 50 billion per annum on drug law enforcement. The UK's 20 billion is made up by 10 billion being the cost of crime, 2 billion in the UK being the cost of drug law enforcement. The number of deaths in the UK costs 7.5 million. And ironically, out of that massive amount, you know, we spend 500 million on treatment. So for that small minority, that 10% or less of drugs users who actually have a problem, we still only spend a fraction of the amount of money that it's costing us. And we know, incidentally, we know from research that every pound you spend on drugs treatment repays many times over in reduced harm. So as I say, we started with the International Opium Convention in 1925. That was codified and made more sophisticated and more comprehensive by the Single Convention on Narcotic Drugs in 1961. And then that was implemented around the world by acts or laws in various different countries. And in the UK, it was the Misuse of Drugs Act in 1971. And as I think many of you will know, you know, that hasn't changed. It's barely been amended since 1971. We've been doing the same thing over and over again for more than 50 years. And then in 1972, Richard Nixon declared the war on drugs, although the war on drugs has actually been going on for a lot longer than that. And it's all about prohibition. This is the essence. This is, in fact, it's not the essence. This is all that they've got to offer. This is the only drugs policy we have. Just say no, and we know how successful that is. So we know this is not. Nobody argues with this. This is agreed. Most crime and violence is caused by criminal drugs markets. But the demand comes from within our own families and communities. It's not somebody else. You know, you can't other this. It's our own people, our families, our brothers, sisters, uncles, fathers, children. That's where the demand comes from. And the street dealing, which prohibition promotes, drives knife crime, robbery, and violence. We know it's agreed again that at least 50% of all acquisitive crime, at least 70% of all shoplifting is related to drugs, and 85% of all those people in prison are there for drug-related crime. That's not necessarily, again, that's not necessarily drug crime, but it's violence, or it's, you know, it's crimes that have been committed in the process of getting money to buy drugs or whatever. Children are exploited as mules and dragged into gang culture. The real problem is where, you know, what happens is the police become the enemy. So you know, the obsession people won't, grassing becomes a problem. You can't grass. But the trouble is,
I was going to ask, where are these statistics taken from? Because again, there's quite.
Well, I mean, they come from different sources. I mean, the 50% of all acquisitive crime, the 70% of all shoplifting comes, I believe, from the National Crime Agency. 85% of all imprisonment is drug-related, comes from government figures. A lot of the latest figures come from Dame Carol Black's recent report, which has got a lot of good information. One of the ironies about Dame Carol Black's recent report, which was the first proper inquiry into drugs policy for a while, was that before she started, that she was specifically instructed that she was not allowed to look at the issue of the law. She wasn't allowed to look at the fact that drugs are prohibited. That wasn't something she was allowed to consider. All she was allowed to consider were the other issues. But as I say, where this really causes a problem in our society is when the police become enemies rather than friends. People won't talk to the police because they're concerned that their children or their brother or whatever are going to get in trouble. And prohibition, I argue, is leading to the breakdown of society. It never works. It just makes the problem worse. Nothing has changed in this 100 years. There's been no review of policy. And the thing I personally find most frustrating is that politicians and media refuse even to discuss it. You watch the BBC or ITV or Sky, you read the newspapers, they report on drugs. In the press, it's usually about sensationalism because it makes good copy. Cannabis crazed axe murderer, etc., etc. It's either cannabis crazed axe murderer or it's cannabis, it saves child with desperate epilepsy. It's sensationalism, one way or the other.
But even, I suppose, something I've noticed as well is that whenever there is a kind of representation of cannabis, particularly in just something like a soap opera or something like that, it always shown in a similar context is always like they went on a downward spiral and started taking drugs like cannabis and just exacerbated like the problems they have, and it's very rare. And I can't even think of an occasion where you see it being like, oh, actually that helped, someone get perspective. Again, it's those kind of broader representations.
Exactly. It's always characterized in that way. It's always seen as a problem. Whereas in fact, we know, as I said earlier, from Professor Johanna Ivor's work, that 90% of all drugs use is without harm, and the people taking the drugs think it's giving them some benefits. The way it's characterized, drugs are characterized in the media is just completely misleading. And then they won't ever even discuss it. If we have if it's economics, if it's health policy, if it's other aspects of crime, if it's any issue you care to think about, you have in-depth discussion about policy, about how policy could be changed, how policy could be adapted. You have interviews with experts. None of that happens about drugs policy. It's sort of in a way, it's like the issue that dare not speak its name. People will not talk about it. So I say we must start talking about it. We must get councillors and MPs engaged. And if you talk to MPs on a one-to-one basis, many of them understand this. It's just that there's this mass inertia to moving forward with it. So I'd encourage anyone to talk to their local politicians about it. Keep going on, radio phone-ins, social media, local newspapers. We have to keep talking about it, because if we don't keep talking about it, nothing will change. What the solution has to be based in evidence and consent. In other words, what the population wants, and reality. The reality is that people do take drugs. People have always taken drugs. And the only way you can reduce the harm of drugs and drugs markets is by taking control of them. And the only way you can take control of them is by regulation, which means legalization. I think this is one of the reasons that politicians in the media won't talk about it, because one, they know that the dreadful mess of it has been made so far, and politicians don't like to admit that. But two, any logical discussion of the issue inevitably leads to legalization, because without putting, how can you control something unless you put it in a legal framework? And they just find it immensely difficult to face up to that reality. So this is my book, as I say, which is going to be published next year. It examines all these issues. When it comes out, I can guarantee you that you'll be seeing publicity for it. Please go out and buy it. Thank you very much.
Excellent. Thank you, Peter. No, that really, really interesting stuff there. I think a couple of things just to sort of pick up on, again, as I sort of went through, I had a couple of questions. I think what's really interesting, I think, about a lot of this is that, I think that when we talk about prohibition, we talk about, that sort of stuff, and putting in legal frameworks, those things don't necessarily work in the way that we'd hope. it's kind of thinking, well, what are the solutions? How can we look at these things differently? I mean, harm reduction, I think, by its very nature itself, is almost like it's almost kind of coming in from a negative perspective, because it presents that there are harms to reduce, when I think largely with cannabis, I'm not saying there aren't any harms, but I think compared to alcohol and other things that we have access to, tobacco, the harms are drastically mitigated. So it's almost like what needs to happen more broadly outside of sort of policy is this kind of reframing. And I'm kind of curious how you think we can kind of sort of shape that narrative, not necessarily just through policy, but through those other kind of initiatives, and what things you've seen work.
Well, I think, as I said a moment ago, I think, the only people who are going to change this are politicians, unfortunately, because we see the caliber of politicians that we have, at least the caliber of senior politicians. If you talk to your local MP, I mean, I often found that they're, in my life, I've had maybe half a dozen local MPs in different places where I've lived, and while some of them have been resistant to the ideas I put forward, they do at least engage with you, and it's only by doing that over and over and over that we will eventually, break through. I mean, I'm 67 now, and I thought, I was convinced when I was a young man that cannabis would be legalized in my lifetime, and now I'm seriously concerned that it might not be, and I find that horrific.
Yes.
Younger MPs have come in, people with wider experience have come in, but at the top of politics, attitudes are still the same.
It's interesting that, I mean, there was nothing, or I don't think there's anything that, the Labour government, in their sort of campaign manifestos mentioned around, legalization or decriminalization of cannabis. It just wasn't on the agenda. I think that's probably deliberately political, because obviously they're trying to appeal to a more, Tory voter base, and not sort of scare off the.
But I mean, there are Tories who take drugs,
Yeah, well, exactly. But again, it's the official line, and then there's kind of, there's this what we believe, and then there's what we. I mean, those are two distinct things. I mean,
even the Liberal Democrats, for instance, or the Liberal Democrats who have legalization and regulation of cannabis in their manifesto, even they say, what we need to do is get skunk off the streets.
Mm-hmm.
So I mean, even they are working on the basis of complete misinformation. The skunk mythology. I mean, so the whole thing is locked into this loop where issues like skunk, which are in the media and used as sensationalism and scaremongering, even those politicians who have a positive view still pick up on this. So the only solution to it is keep talking to people about it. Please, really, to individuals, I say to you, please talk to your MP about it. Talk to your local MP about it. I've always found you can send all the emails you want. What really makes a difference is actually when you go and make an appointment to see them in their surgery and go and talk. That's the only way we're going to move forward with this. So anyway, thank you for listening.
No, I think that's really, really interesting. And no, thank you for coming on and sharing your thoughts. And look forward to seeing your book when it comes out. And fully expecting a signed copy. So there we go. Put it out there now for posterity. No, thank you, Peter. Really appreciate it. And thanks for joining us. And glad you got a chance to do it again. So.